He was a respected farmer, but what we found in his barn sent shivers down the spine of the entire town. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The road stretched into the distance like a pale scar, cutting through fields that had long since been left to the wind. Grass grew in ragged patches, dotted with rusting farm equipment, and weather-beaten fence posts that leaned toward the ground as if they, too, had given up on holding anything back. Emily sat in the passenger seat of the old pickup truck, her hands folded in her lap, while Jake kept his eyes on the cracked asphalt ahead. The late afternoon sun cast a washed-out glow over everything, flattening colors and making the world look older, as though time had been leached from it. They spoke in low voices about their plans for the property, the workshop they wanted to build, the possibility of turning the place into something useful, maybe even a small business that would finally pull them out of their cramped rental apartment in the city. For a moment, it felt like a step forward, a clean slate. But when they turned down the long dirt drive and the silhouette of the hangar came into view, Emily felt a prickle run along her arms. The building loomed larger with every foot they drove, its roof half collapsed, the sheet metal side streaked with rust as though the place had been bleeding for years. The air seemed heavier here, tinged with the scent of old earth and something faintly metallic that drifted even through the open truck windows. Jake slowed the truck and cut the engine, letting the silence rush in around them. There were no birds, no hum of insects, no sounds at all, but the ticking of the engine cooling. They climbed out together, boots crunching on the gravel. Emily tilted her head back, staring at the hangar. It was even bigger than she remembered from the one time she had come here as a child, holding her mother's hand and feeling out of place while her grandfather stood a little way off, silent and watchful. He had never been a warm man. She remembered his narrow eyes, the way he never smiled in photographs, the sense that he carried secrets, like other men carried pocket knives, tucked away, but always near to hand. He had left her this place when he died, bypassing everyone else in the family, and for months Emily had wondered whether it was an inheritance or a punishment. They walked to the hangar door, which stood slightly ajar, and with a shove from Jake, it groaned open. Dust spiraled in the slanting light. The smell hit her first. Damp wood, animal musk, and the sharp tang of metal. Inside, the space was a cavern of shadows. Shafts of light pierced through holes in the roof, falling onto the concrete floor in pale geometric shapes. Piles of old equipment lay scattered rusted tools, cracked buckets, warped planks. In one corner, a mound of yellowed bales of hay had partially collapsed, their strands spilling out like brittle hair. Somewhere in the dark recesses, something small scurried away at their approach. Jake whistled low, his voice echoing, "Well, it's big. That's something." His tone was light, almost amused, but Emily didn't laugh. She took a slow step inside, feeling the temperature drop slightly, as though the place had been holding its breath for years. She ran her fingers over a nearby workbench. Dust coated her skin in a gray film. She tried to imagine her grandfather here, what he had done in this place, what had kept him so busy that he rarely left the property. They set to work, clearing space, stacking broken boards, and rolling aside empty oil drums. The sound of their movements filled the hangar, every clatter and scrape amplified by the metal walls. As the hours passed, the sun lowered outside, and the beams of light became warmer, thicker, until they resembled pillars holding up the air itself. Emily tried to shake the unease coiling in her stomach. She told herself that this was simply an old farm building, that the oppressive stillness was just in her head. Yet every time she glanced at the darker corners, she felt as though something was waiting there, just beyond sight. Near the back wall stood a set of tall shelves, the wood sagging under the weight of rusted tools and forgotten containers. Jake started pulling items down, passing them to Emily, who stacked them on the floor. When they reached the bottom shelf, Jake's hand knocked against something solid. He crouched and cleared the dust and debris, revealing a rectangular piece of metal set flush into the floor. It had a small ring in the center. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, his earlier humor fading. Together, they pried it open. The hinges shrieked in protest, releasing a breath of air so stale it seemed to carry years with it. A narrow set of steps led downward into darkness. Jake shone his flashlight into the space below. The beam cut through the gloom and landed on concrete walls, a low ceiling, and the faint outline of what looked like beds. Emily's heart thudded painfully. Without a word, she descended first, her boots ringing on the metal steps. The air was damp and close, smelling of mildew and rust. As she stepped into the room, the light revealed its full contents. 4 narrow metal cots lined up against the walls, their frames corroded, but still intact. Chains hung from hooks, set into the concrete, some still attached to iron shackles that lay open like discarded bracelets. The floor was littered with scraps of fabric-tattered blankets, shirts, something that might once have been a child's dress. In the far corner, a dented enamel mug sat on its side, as though it had been dropped and never retrieved. Emily moved slowly, her breath shallow. The silence was almost unbearable, and yet she thought she could hear something, an echo of movement, of voices that were no longer there. She crouched to pick up a small shoe lying by one of the beds. It was scuffed and worn through at the toe, the laces still knotted, as though waiting for someone to put them back on. Her throat tightened. She could not imagine any benign reason for a hidden room like this to exist. Not with chains on the walls and children's shoes on the floor. Jake remained at the top of the stairs, the beam of his flashlight jittering slightly, as though his hand had started to shake. For once, he said nothing. Emily rose slowly, clutching the shoe. The room felt like a tomb, a place where time had stopped, but memory had not. Her grandfather's presence pressed on her from every wall, not as a kindly old man, but as someone she might not have known at all. She turned toward Jake, her face pale, and in that moment, she understood that they had found something they were never meant to find. When they climbed back into the main part of the hangar, the evening sky had deepened into bruised purple, and the first stars were starting to appear. Emily stood just outside the open door, staring at the horizon, the shoe still in her hand. Behind her, the dark mouth of the hatch gaped like a wound in the floor. She knew they could not simply close it and pretend it was never there. Whatever had happened in that room had left its mark, and now it was on her to decide what to do with it. The wind picked up, rattling the loose metal siding, making the whole structure groan as if it were alive. Emily felt the sound deep in her chest. Somewhere, she thought, there were answers, buried in the past, buried with her grandfather. But they would not stay buried forever. That night, Emily barely slept. The image of the shoe would not leave her mind, nor the smell of the room beneath the hangar. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the narrow beds, the dangling chains, the stains on the concrete floor. She felt as if she had opened a door that should have remained closed, yet at the same time, she could not stop thinking that whatever had happened there deserved to be known. When dawn broke, pale and indifferent, she was already awake. Sitting at the kitchen table of the small house on the edge of the property, staring out at the mist that pooled over the fields. Jake had fallen asleep on the couch sometime in the early hours, and when he stirred, she did not speak. There was nothing to say that would make the night feel less real. After a silent breakfast, she went back to the hangar alone. The air inside was colder, the light grayer, but she no longer hesitated as she crossed the dusty floor and descended the metal stairs. The room was exactly as they had left it. She crouched and began examining every object, every corner, as if piecing together a puzzle. She found scraps of paper near one of the cots, edges eaten by dampness, but still bearing traces of handwriting. She brushed off the dirt carefully. The letters were faded, written in a language she didn't recognize, but she could make out a few words in English, as though someone had been trying to write a message to be found one day. Her fingers trembled as she stacked the scraps together and slipped them into her pocket. The day stretched on as she collected what she could: bits of fabric, the enamel mug, a rusted lock from one of the chains. She placed them on the workbench upstairs in the hangar, arranging them like evidence. The wind outside picked up, whistling through the gaps in the walls, making the entire place sound like it was sighing. She shivered but did not leave. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her grandfather's presence, not as a vague family memory, but as a man whose choices were carved into this place. By late afternoon, she decided she needed to know more, to place what she had found into the context of the town's history. She drove into town, to the old library on Main Street, a squat brick building that smelled of paper and dust. The archivist, a tired-looking woman with wire-rimmed glasses, directed her to the back room where they kept the microfilm and bound copies of local newspapers dating back decades. Emily sat for hours at a long wooden table, the light humming overhead, flipping through yellowed pages. The headlines from the years her grandfather had run the farm told stories of harvests, county fairs, local politics. But in the small columns near the bottom, she began to notice patterns, reports of missing farmhands, drifters who had last been seen looking for work, families who had arrived from out of state and then moved on without notice. There were no follow-up articles, no investigations, just a silence that felt too deliberate. One clipping caught her eye, a photograph of her grandfather at a charity event, smiling stiffly as he handed over a donation check to the local church. The caption praised his generosity and his contribution to the community. Emily stared at his face for a long time, wondering how a man could stand there, lauded as a pillar of society, while such darkness might have been hidden on his land. She felt a pang of nausea, a betrayal that seemed to reach across time. When she returned home, the sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. Jake was waiting on the porch, arms crossed. He asked where she had been, and when she told him, his expression hardened. He said they needed to be careful, that stirring up rumors about her grandfather could bring trouble they didn't want. They had plans, he reminded her, plans to start fresh, to turn this place into something good. Why risk losing that? Emily listened, but her mind was far away, still in the library, still staring at those headlines. She told him she could not ignore what she had found. His frustration was visible, his words sharp but weary, and when he finally went inside, she remained outside until the last light faded. That night she dreamed again of the room, but now it was full of figures, blurred shapes sitting on the cots, heads bowed, shadows stretching across the walls. She heard chains clinking softly, a child crying somewhere in the darkness. When she woke, her face was wet with tears. She sat up in bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house. It felt as if the land itself was whispering to her, urging her to go back. In the following days, she visited the room again and again. Each time she discovered something new: a small carved figure tucked behind one of the cots, a strip of cloth knotted as if it had been used as a bandage, a broken piece of wood with faint notches scratched into it, marks that might have been used to count the days. She laid them all out on the workbench until the surface was covered with mute artifacts. To Jake, it looked like junk. But to Emily, it was a map of pain, each object a clue to the lives that had been trapped here. Her obsession grew. She stopped answering phone calls, stopped going into town except to gather more records. She spoke less and less to Jake, who began to look at her with a mixture of worry and exasperation. One evening he told her that whatever had happened here was in the past, that they had no obligation to dig it up. But Emily could not stop. She felt as if she were standing at the edge of a pit, and if she turned away now, the voices inside would never be heard. One afternoon, as she was kneeling near the far corner of the room, she noticed a loose stone in the floor. She worked it free with her hands until it came loose, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside was a metal box, rusted but still intact. She carried it upstairs and pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside lay a single bracelet, tarnished, but clearly once precious, and a folded scrap of paper. The paper was so fragile it almost crumbled, but she unfolded it carefully. The drawing on it was childish, a crude picture of a house with a fence and stick figures behind it, each with sad faces. There were chains drawn around their legs. Emily stared at it for a long time, her chest tight. It was not just an artifact. It was a cry, preserved for decades, waiting for someone to find it. She sat on the workbench, holding the bracelet in one hand and the drawing in the other, and felt the weight of all the silence pressing down on her. Her grandfather's legacy was not just the land he had left her, but the pain that had seeped into it. She knew now that she could not remain passive, could not simply keep these objects as curiosities. They demanded something of her, an answer, an action, a reckoning. When Jake came into the hangar that evening, he saw her sitting there in the dim light, surrounded by the evidence she had gathered. He said nothing at first, only looked at her with tired eyes. She did not look up. The wind howled outside, rattling the walls, and the sound seemed to echo the turmoil between them. For Emily, the path forward was becoming clear, even if it meant walking it alone. She could feel the moment solidifying inside her like cooled metal. She would find out everything. She would uncover the truth, no matter what it cost. The days that followed felt like a strange half-light, as though Emily were moving through a world that had shifted slightly on its axis. The artifacts from the room beneath the hangar remained spread across the workbench, silently accusing her each time she passed. She found herself unable to focus on anything else. The farm, the house, even Jake's voice seemed distant. Every morning she woke with the same thought. There were people out there, living or dead, who knew what had happened here, and she had to find them. She began by driving to the older parts of town, where the houses leaned with age, and the porches sagged under peeling paint. She knocked on doors, introduced herself politely, asked if anyone remembered working on her grandfather's farm. Some people shut their doors without a word. Others muttered that they didn't know anything and turned away. The few who spoke gave her vague answers. Yes, her grandfather had been a hard man, but he paid his debts and minded his own business. One old woman squinted at Emily with something like fear and told her not to stir up the past. That night, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering why so many people seemed determined to protect the memory of a man who might have done unspeakable things. Her persistence eventually led her to the edge of town, to a weathered house surrounded by dead cornstalks. The man who answered the door was thin and stooped, his face lined like old leather, his eyes wary but clear. His name was Samuel, and when Emily explained who she was, he hesitated a long moment before stepping aside and letting her in. The inside of the house smelled of wood smoke and liniment. They sat at a table covered with a faded checkered cloth, and at first, Samuel spoke of ordinary things: weather, harvests, neighbors long gone, But when Emily asked about her grandfather, his expression changed. He told her that many years ago he had worked on the farm. At first it had been good work, hard but honest. But then others began to disappear. People would come looking for a job and never be seen again. Samuel lowered his voice, as if the walls might still be listening, and told her that some of them had been locked away when they tried to leave. Her grandfather kept them there until they agreed to work for nothing but food. Some escaped, but most stayed, too frightened or too weak to run. Samuel's own brother had been among them. He grew sick in the hidden room beneath the hangar and died one winter when the cold was too much to bear. They buried him behind the barn at night with no marker. Emily listened, her throat tight, the room spinning slightly around her. Samuel's voice was steady, not accusing, just weary. He said he had never spoken of it to anyone outside his family because he had been afraid of what might happen. Men like her grandfather had power in those days, and the town preferred not to look too closely at where its cheap labor came from. When Emily left the house, the sky was gray and heavy, and a thin rain began to fall. She drove back to the farm with her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. The truth was worse than she had imagined, and now she carried it like a stone in her chest. She told Jake what Samuel had said, but instead of relief or sympathy, his face darkened. He said that old stories could not be trusted, that stirring them up could ruin them both. The town would see her as a troublemaker, maybe even as someone trying to destroy her own family's name. In the days that followed, she began to feel the shift in the air whenever she went into town. People who once nodded politely now turned away. Conversation stopped when she entered the grocery store. Someone scrawled a crude message in chalk on the edge of her driveway. "Let the dead stay buried." Jake was angry now, not just worried. He told her that she was tearing them apart for the sake of ghosts. Emily heard him, but she could not turn back. Each time she descended into the room beneath the hangar, she felt closer to those who had been trapped there, closer to understanding what they had suffered. She could not abandon them, not now. The tension between her and Jake thickened until the house felt like it was holding its breath. Meals were silent, footsteps heavy. At night, she dreamed of Samuel's brother, dreamed of him reaching out to her from the corner of the room, his lips moving in a plea she could not hear. She began gathering all the evidence she had collected, the letters, the photographs, the drawing, the bracelet, Samuel's story written down in her own careful hand, and she placed them in a box. She told herself she would bring them to the newspaper in the next town over, somewhere far enough away that people might take her seriously. One evening, as the wind howled around the house and the rain beat against the windows, Jake finally confronted her. He said he could not live this way, that if she chose this path, she was choosing it alone. His voice was tired, broken, and when he left the house that night with a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder, Emily did not stop him. She watched him go from the porch, the truck's taillights glowing red as they disappeared down the drive. The darkness closed in around her. But she felt a strange clarity. Inside the hangar, the room below waited, silent and cold. She went down the steps and sat on the edge of one of the cots, the box of evidence beside her. The air was damp, smelling of rust and old sorrow, but she no longer feared it. This was not just a place of death anymore. It was a place of truth. And tomorrow, she would carry that truth into the light, no matter who tried to stop her. Morning came gray and sharp, as though the sky itself had been scrubbed clean during the night. Emily woke on the couch with the box of evidence still on the coffee table where she had left it, its contents spilling slightly over the edge, as if impatient to be taken. Her head ached from lack of sleep, but her resolve had hardened into something immovable. She packed the box carefully, wrapped it in a blanket, and loaded it into the truck. The drive to the next town felt longer than usual. The road empty and silent, the fields on either side washed pale by mist. The newspaper office was a modest brick building on the corner of a quiet street. Inside, the air smelled of ink and coffee. A young reporter listened intently as Emily laid out the artifacts, the letters, and the story Samuel had told her. His eyes widened with each piece she placed on the table, his pencil flying over the notepad. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then he told her that what she had was important, that it needed to be shared, and that he would speak to his editor immediately. They took photographs of the items, of Emily herself, her hands resting on the box like a guardian of memory. The following week, the story appeared on the front page. The headline was blunt, unflinching. Beneath it was a photograph of the hangar, the rusted metal gaping like a wound, and another of the room below with its narrow cots and chains. The article told of the forced labor, the deaths, the silence of a town that had chosen not to see. Emily's name was printed there too, her words quoted as she spoke of reckoning with the past. The reaction was immediate. Reporters came from other towns, even from the city. Television crews set up cameras on the property, their bright lights harsh against the dark opening of the hatch. Some neighbors came to see for themselves, standing at a distance as though the hangar might swallow them whole. Strangers left flowers by the door, but others came in anger, muttering that Emily had dragged her family's name through the mud, that she had brought shame on the town. Someone painted slurs on her fence one night, and she spent the next morning scrubbing them off with numb hands. The authorities opened an investigation, though most of what they found was decades old and beyond prosecution. Still, the investigation gave weight to her grandfather's victims, acknowledging that they had been wronged. Records were uncovered, names recovered, and the site was officially marked as a place of historical significance. It was no longer a secret, no longer just Emily's burden. Yet the division in the town deepened. At the grocery store, some people thanked her quietly, pressing her hand before hurrying away, while others glared as though she had betrayed them personally. The tension was something she could feel under her skin, a constant reminder that truth, once spoken, could not be taken back. But she did not regret it. Each time she walked to the hangar and descended into the room, she felt a strange peace now. The silence there was no longer accusing. It was listening. Emily decided that the place could not simply remain as it was. She contacted an architect from a nearby city and explained what she wanted. A small memorial, nothing elaborate, just a space where people could come and remember. Workmen cleared the debris, cleaned the walls, reinforced the structure. They left the cots and chains in place, but placed them behind glass, preserving them as testimony. A simple bronze plaque was mounted near the entrance, engraved with the names Emily had found in letters and local records. Beneath the list of names, a single line was inscribed: "May they never be forgotten." When the memorial was finished, people began to come. Some left candles, others small tokens or handwritten notes. Emily visited often, sitting quietly on a bench near the entrance, watching as strangers moved through the space in silence. Each time she left, she felt lighter, as though a piece of the weight she carried had been set down there. It was during one of these visits, on a clear afternoon with the sun slanting through the open door, that Jake returned. She heard the crunch of tires on the gravel and turned to see him standing by the truck, uncertain, his face drawn but softer than she remembered. He walked slowly toward her, his gaze shifting between her and the memorial. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he stepped inside, moving from cot to cot, his hand brushing the glass. When he came back out, his expression was solemn but no longer angry. He told her he understood now why she had done what she did, that she had been right to bring the truth into the light, even if it had cost them both. They stood together in front of the plaque, the air quiet around them. The wind rustled the grass outside, and a single bird called from the fence post. It felt like the first true silence Emily had heard since opening the hatch, not the silence of fear, but of completion. She reached for Jake's hand, and this time he did not pull away. In the weeks that followed, Emily organized a fundraiser for organizations that fought modern-day slavery and human trafficking. The response was greater than she expected. Letters arrived from descendants of those who had once worked in the area, thanking her for giving voice to stories that had been buried. School groups came to the memorial to learn, to ask questions, to bear witness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned the color of deep copper, Emily stood alone before the plaque. The names glowed faintly in the fading light. She thought of Samuel, of his brother. Of all the men and women whose footsteps had echoed in that room beneath the ground. She whispered a promise to them that she would keep telling their story as long as she had breath. When she finally turned to leave, she looked back once more at the hangar. It no longer seemed menacing. It stood like a sentinel now, a guardian of memory. She knew the past would never be erased, but it no longer felt like a shadow. It was part of her, part of the land, part of the truth that had set her free. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.